Okay, let's talk about direct democracy. Now again, if you go back to the Politics Shed site and click on direct democracy, you'll see a definition of direct democracy. Now the first most important impression I want that page to give you is that direct democracy means more than referendums. In fact, referendums are going to be dealt with separately. So we'll look at referendums, we'll look at the pros and cons of referendums and how they've been used in the UK. And later on, of course, with this course, we'll look at how referendums are used in the United States. Now, when the Greeks were developing democracy in Athens in the 4th and 5th century, largely they didn't do a lot of voting. Actually, they did more a process that we call today, or a system we call today, sortition. And sortition means people taking part in politics actually themselves. Now, we use sortition in the form of juries. Juries are randomly selected, and yet they can have a big impact on people's lives and the outcome of cases. They can also, of course, set new laws by contributing to what's known as common law and case law through precedent. If you want to explore common law and case law right now, before we get to it in the course, follow the link next to this video. The Greeks used sortition then more than they used voting in the sense that we would know it. They used a machine called a cleriterium, where you dropped in little beads and the beads ran down and they selected people at random from the population to take part in politics. There's a short film to show you how that works.
Randomly select 500 citizens who were the council of 500 who would select the agenda for the assembly. Then they would also randomly select the jurors in the courts with the same machine. They also use that machine. You have to look it up. It's a little bit of a Rube Goldberg contraption. Look it up online to see how it works. There's some illustrations because a lot of it was wood that is no longer available. But the random samples would deliberate, setting the agenda. If someone made an illegal proposal in the assembly, they could be...
So could sortition be employed today and beyond simply the use in juries, but into the second chamber of parliament, or maybe the first chamber of parliament, into local government and into consultation, into what's known as citizens' juries as well. So there's a number of ways you could use sortition, randomly selecting groups of the population, groups of people from the population, to take part in political decisions, or to be consulted over political decisions, or to actually make political decisions. That was Brett Hennig of the Sortition Foundation, and it's a pressure group that argues for the greater use of sortition, citizens' juries and the like, to improve our democracy. And you might see that sortition is often seen as an answer to the problems of representative democracy and for the existence of a professional class of politicians. You'll notice how the getting rid of politicians got a sort of complicit laugh from the audience. And a general recognition that one of the problems of representative democracy are our politicians. Or they can be seen that way at least. Well, so would sortition work for our society? Well, many people in recent books and articles have pointed to the fact that we have a sort of spare second chamber, the House of Lords, which is in a sort of stalled process of reform. Itself already a form of sortition, not exactly a random sortition, but a selected process anyway for choosing life peers. So why not use sortition in the second chamber? Whether Brett Hennig would argue that that should be actually, all of legislative assemblies should be chosen by sortition or not. Well, he does actually argues that. Now that would be a more extreme form of sortition. Well, the objections to sortition might be that, for instance, it's rather a luxury. You depend upon the assumption that not only will crowds be reasonable, but they'll be well informed and reasonably literate, or at least reasonably literate. Would, for instance, sortition work in Victorian London, when the majority of the population were illiterate or semi-literate? Would it work in many places in the world today where state education was not common? Would it work would it work generally in even developed societies where the arrival of social media and the selective, self-selected access to the media has created a kind of echo chamber population which only sees the world through information that they personally select, with the proliferation of things like conspiracy theories. Apparently it's not. The last election in the United States, very large numbers of quite well-educated people believe that the election had been a fraud in some way that was difficult to sustain if you looked at it carefully. Also, it's not unknown for people to believe in quite extraordinary things like the QAnon conspiracy, or that the virus or the pandemic is some kind of hoax. Now these might be extreme, that's got a lunatic fringe, or it might be that we are in an age of fake news, false information, and that may have been illustrated in America at the last election.
Coming back into the Capitol building, we have cheers from the protesters that are watching behind the scenes. This is incredible.
Possibly being a little unfair to sortition there. Clearly, a random selection of people makes us think, well, people aren't necessarily well qualified. There are a lot of difficult decisions to make, a lot of expert things to see. Juries have a problem, of course, with overcoming the fact that juries are made up of amateurs, often if they're dealing with a difficult financial case or difficult points of law. However, it's anyone who's met politicians or observed politicians in action wouldn't necessarily think that the method of choosing politicians themselves chooses the brightest and the best. No one could have lived through the age of Trump and thought that a rigorous and lengthy selection process it resulted in the brightest and the best. Philosopher kings don't tend to make it into power in democracies. However, maybe that's not the point. Maybe democracies aren't about choosing the brightest and the best, or making the best decisions even. Democracy is about making legitimate decisions, legitimately good decisions and legitimately bad decisions. So sortition does involve a trust in the wisdom of crowds, or rather the sense that a reasonable group of people will act reasonably, and rejecting the danger of crowds. The danger of crowds, ever since Madison in the Federalist Papers, or Burke in his observations on the French Revolution, looked at crowds and the mob and saw something quite different. That a orator or a brilliant speaker or a populist or someone might inflame the passions of the mob, and much representative democracy is about dissipating and putting some sort of barrier between the crowd or the mob or the people and their passions and decisions made without passion. So decisions made without passion might be one of the arguments for representative democracy. Now the speakers just argued that actually what you would have in a sortition situation or a citizens' assembly is not a crowd, but a selection that represents the population and is deliberative. It thinks, it's advised, its concerns are thought out among themselves. People debate and argue, so they act very much like a kind of legislative assembly rather than, but the difference being that they're not elected. Well, that might well work that way. It might well be that that will insulate them against the rabble-rouser or the powerful personality or the charismatic individual who carries a group forward, especially if there are a broad selection of the population. It might produce another problem, of course, and the other problem is that a broad selection of the population brought together to deliberate might result in very consensual, very limited, very compromised sorts of views. In other words, it'd be very difficult to get things done. And anyone who's had a group of people where you're trying to achieve some sort of median understanding that would please old people, young people, rich people, poor people, might end up with very watered down, kind of bland politics indeed. And that might be, though, exactly what you want. You want a watered down, kind of bland politics, acts as a brake on extremism. However, consultative situations, and people may have experienced this, whether they've worked in a big corporation or a public company or a public organisation, where consultation is going to take place, and invariably the consultation involves some sort of selection of the workforce or selection of the staff or selection of the local population to consider a range of options, and they will generally produce a range of options. And from that range of options, the people who set up the consultation will generally choose their preferred option. So there is such a thing as sort of sham consultation and sham direct politics, where in fact the exercise becomes a tick box. That consultation takes place is the aim, rather than producing some kind of decision by the people. I think that might be a danger. For sortition to succeed, you have to rely, though, on the possibility that it's a random selection of people. Of course, it won't be random, by the way. Sortition invariably involves some kind of selection. That is, a selection to ensure that half the crowd, half the jury are female and half the jury male, that some are rich, some are poor, some are old, some are young, and so on. So in the end you start selecting in that way, and where do you stop? You might want to select different classes and different incomes and different viewpoints to try and reflect society. And of course you'd be in danger there of trying to select a jury that you thought reflected the views in the first place. Well, that's what politicians are. So if you could avoid selecting on viewpoint, you might end up just selecting a broadly reflective group of people that reflect the population as a whole. Well, largely that would work. It would probably work as well as opinion polls work. And opinion polls do work. Curiously, if you ask 1,000 people or 2,000 people their views on matters, you can get a fairly accurate idea about the things that are popular and the things that are unpopular. Would you want that? Would you want to be led by a group of people who did actually fairly reasonably reflect the views of people at any given time? And then again, it would be any given time. Should juries be selected fairly regularly? Would you have to have one jury, followed by another jury, followed by another jury, in order to keep up with changing views? Or, if your aim was that juries themselves should be reflective of people's views, and would you want that? If you could achieve it, if you could achieve a randomly selected cross-section of the population who would reflect the views at any given time, you wouldn't want that, or would you? You might well think immediately, of course you would. That's indeed what politicians, what democracy is about. It's about power in the hands of the people. And so the argument for sortition is that it can be a very democratic way of reflecting the will of the people. Of course, as the Greeks themselves found, that one of the problems, it didn't last very long for them. They were persuaded by a particularly populist orator to involve themselves in a lengthy and difficult war against the Spartans and a disastrous campaign against Syracuse. They themselves adapted that, brought in certain checks. Well, the simple way of overcoming the problems of sortition, of direct democracy, is representative democracy. So we will view representative democracy not as a simple practical way of representing very large numbers. It's more than that. It's an answer to some of the problems of democracy itself. But of course, it creates new ones.